Today, I'm going to be talking about NextDecade, specifically about the recent court ruling with the DC Court of Appeals that overturned their FERC approval effectively. And I'm going to be going through the details on that. So if you're interested in that, stick around. Before I begin, let me remind you that I'm not a financial advisor or a financial professional of any sort. All opinions I express in this video are mine and do not represent those of any company or any other individual. I currently hold a long position in NextDecade, so this video should be for your entertainment purposes only, because I could be wrong about everything I say in this video, and you need to do your own research before making any investment decisions. All right, so NextDecade, if you just want the summary, the court basically said that FERC failed to actually go through, and this is me speaking as a non-expert, that they failed to go through the correct process to actually assess the environmental impact when they went through this sort of remand process to go through kind of the sort of an appeal on their original FERC approval that they happened in, 2021 or so. And so basically, the DC Court of Appeals said you didn't go through the correct process when you were going through this remand and addressing all the concerns at that point. And so they are overturning the FERC approval for now. I'm going to go through the details and go through the actual court ruling in just a moment so that you can understand this in much more detail if you are interested in NextDecade, so that you can have a better understanding of kind of the details here to make an assessment for yourself on what this could mean. Obviously, and I have this press release up from NextDecade that I will note real quick, their comment was they disagree with the court's conclusions. At this time, and this is critical, construction continues on the first 3 liquefaction trains. So that is a pretty big point for us to know as investors. Of course, they say they're evaluating the impact on their on train 4 on that potential FID. It really matters a lot more because I think this applies to the whole facility. So, if they're able to at least continue on with the first 3 trains, that's of critical importance. And the impact on the future trains, of course, is just as important. But I think, at least those have not actually started construction yet. So there's nothing really to pause at the moment. All right. So let me go through the actual court ruling here. And I've got some notes I'm going to try. I'm not just going to read through 34 pages of text, of course. But I do have some things that I wanted to highlight and sort of give you a pretty decent overview of what was written here. So basically, starting off here, I'm going to start with, this is on page 8. This is all written by the actual DC Circuit Court of Appeals. And so they say ultimately, talking about their original decision when they did the remand, they said they remanded without vacatur, right, without vacating the original procedure, because they found it likely that the commission could have remedied their deficiencies while reaching the same result. So basically, they're talking about the process that they did do in 2021 when NextDecade's approval was originally challenged, and the court actually upheld their approval and basically did not turn anything back, and it sort of just addressed the concerns of the environmentalists effectively who were challenging their approval. And they said, we let that go through because even though there might have been some issues, it seemed like even if they addressed those issues, they would have came to the same result very clearly. But in this one, they talk more, and so going on a little bit down here, on this particular challenge, the petitioners asked the court to review the remand orders. They had even more things where they're talking about here. And they say, while the petitions were pending, the commission issued orders addressing the rehearsing requests and sustaining the reauthorizations, right? So basically, they upheld everything initially. Now, if we go on just a tad bit, they basically had multiple challenges to the original orders. And so this is the environmentalists had those challenges. And so we're going to go through these just a little bit so you can understand what the DC Court of Appeals said. And they said, when they were conducting these reviews of the proposed natural gas projects, the commission follows this order, which, and this is critical, directs the federal agencies to identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects, basically the impact on what they call these environmental justice communities. And so this is a pretty big thing to understand if you're trying to understand what this court said, because this is one of the key issues that actually got them to roll back their approval. as part of this, and sort of a bit of a procedural thing, and we're going to get to that. But this is important because more or less they didn't, when they were going through these additional concerns and went through the remand process and issued this additional order, this additional sort of like upholding their original approval, FERC did not go through the full process, the full environmental impact statement process, to understand the impacts on these environmental justice communities. And that is a key bit here. And so if we go down just a tad bit more, they do say here, the commission did not adequately explain why, despite its, quote, determination that the environmental effects from the project would extend well beyond 2 miles from the project sites, it then chose to analyze basically only within 2 miles of the project site. And so this was one of the key issues here, where this Court of Appeals said, you guys only looked at a 2-mile radius, even though you said there were going to be impacts more broadly than that. And so that was a big deal for the court to say, you know, you didn't actually follow the full process. And so they did sort of address this, and they talk about it here. That was sort of the original issue, right? And so on the remand, they said, and again, this was after the initial approval that FERC gave to NextDecade. This was the remand process, and they upheld the original approval. But they say they did update their, they got additional information for a block within 50 kilometers of the project, not just 2 miles, but almost 31 miles. And they did that, but then they did not, and this is critical, they did not prepare its analysis in the form of a supplemental environmental impact statement. So this is the piece that was a really big deal, and this is, I think, what the Court of Appeals is kind of hanging on, is they're saying you updated, you got updated data, but you didn't actually then make a supplemental environmental impact statement for this broader radius as you did for the original approval, where you did for only this 2-mile radius. And so now they got this updated data, and had they made a supplemental environmental impact statement, it would have had to have gotten, you know, public comment. They would have given them this 45-day period for public comment. And so I think that was also an important issue for the court, you know, that there needs this public comment period. And this is what they say. This is a procedural step that the commission skipped here. So this is a key point. The commission did not actually make this environmental impact statement when they should have. You know, that's basically what this next paragraph says, that and this is another legal term that I've seen before. They say this was an arbitrary and capricious decision, meaning they sort of just decided not to do this FERC decided not to do this environmental impact statement in this instance without really any good rhyme or reason. That's kind of my interpretation of what arbitrary and capricious means in a legal sense. Again, I'm not a lawyer. Hopefully that should be pretty clear up front in this video. But what they're saying here is they're agreeing. They're saying, you know, well, FERC just decided not to do the environmental impact statement because, you know, they really didn't have a good reason. And so it was arbitrary and capricious. And, you know, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals says we agree. So if we keep going, there is another really important point here where they kind of say, all the way down here in, they do say, the commission also, and they say most fundamentally, the commission they found that the projects would not have any disproportionate adverse effects on environmental justice communities, but then in the updated analysis, they say that there would be impacts on those environmental justice populations, and that they would be, you know, predominantly borne by the environmental justice communities, meaning that there is this disproportionate impact on them. And so this is a thing that, you know, the federal government, as of right now, has guidelines and standards, and so this is a big deal for them. They're basically saying, well, you kind of said that there are going to be these additional impacts, and so that's when it's really important for you to have gone through this process. And you know, FERC, for you know, its original rationale, they say the commission did say they, you know, quote, we're not required to prepare a supplemental environmental impact statement because the issues addressed on remand did not result in any new significance determinations. And so basically FERC is saying, we don't think there was anything new and significant that changed our minds for giving the approval. Therefore, we didn't create the supplemental environmental impact statement. But the DC Circuit Court of Appeals is pretty clear here, and they're saying, you know, that's not a good reason, because, you know, the reason why you make the supplemental environmental impact statement is not necessarily just because there's a new determination. it's because there's, basically new information. Should be somewhere in here. Yeah. So the NEPA requires an environmental impact statement if any significant impacts might result from the proposed action, right? Which, again, in this case, is all the remand process, all those challenges up front, that they did go through some additional process here, and they, as I mentioned, they ultimately upheld the approval originally during the remand process. But the court here is saying, because you didn't do this environmental impact statement, this supplemental one, and go through this public comment period, you didn't follow the full process, right? You said that there wasn't any new determination because of that, but the standard here, you should have done that if it might result from that action. So that's kind of what the appeals court here is saying, is they're just really driving home the point that FERC really should have done that. And so I'm not going to go through everything in here. Let me look through my notes. But I think that's the gist of it here is, hopefully I've driven it home to you if you're watching, where you're seeing FERC did not go through this. And, I guess I'll go down to, there's another couple things to highlight where they really also mention again, and they highlight, because they didn't do that, they did not solicit public comment, as to, where they actually got all the data underlying this environmental justice analysis. Just in general, they didn't go through the full process. And so there are some just, again, procedural issues that FERC did with how they actually upheld the approval during the remand process. And there was one other thing that I wanted to mention that, they were really throwing it out here. Yeah, so I guess I skipped it just a little bit. And I think the DC Circuit Court of Appeals is not just thinking about this particular case. They're also thinking about what is the precedent that this sets. So I think that's why this is one thing that for me, I sort of read that with a little bit of optimism. Let me explain in just a moment. So they were very clear here where they say, the unavoidable implication of the commission's argument that, hey, we don't need to do a supplemental environmental impact statement if, if we don't think there's, if we don't think there's a difference in our determination, they're basically saying here, it's important for you to do that. The unavoidable implication of their argument here is that, is that people in the future would say, oh, it's not important enough to require a supplemental environmental impact statement because, unless there's some known significant impact to the physical environment, not just these environmental justice communities, but to the physical environment. Because maybe I skipped over it a little bit, but I think, one of the things that FERC said is they said, hey, based on what we did here, there's no difference to the air quality impacts that we've already looked at, and so therefore we don't need to do this supplemental environmental impact statement. But what the DC Circuit Court of Appeals here is saying is that, if we let this go through and we actually, if we sort of give the thumbs up to FERC's argument here, in the future, this would mean that folks who go through this remand process and they're looking at that, they're saying, oh, there's no impact of the physical environment, would mean that they don't need to go through and examine fully the impacts to these environmental justice communities. And again, putting aside my opinion on, on all of, what I think about environmental justice communities, and that sort of analysis, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals is looking at this and saying, we can't set the precedent that people can ignore this environmental justice analysis and treat this as, sort of a lower importance than the physical environment. So again, these are just the EPA standards and the federal guidelines that the DC Circuit Court of Appeals is looking at. And so why I think that is to some degree optimistic is because it seems like it's reasonable that the DC Circuit Court of Appeals is, overturned their approval because they don't want this precedent to be set, not because they think that there's any particular deficiency with, with Rio Grande or anything specifically about that. It's that they didn't want to set this precedent, because it is, important to note that this whole thing, if you go all the way back to the beginning, this is not just for Rio Grande. This is for that and also for the Texas LNG project. I think they, so it's also for the Texas LNG, and they're not exactly the same, but, the fact that they wanted to lump the two together and they wanted to say, hey, this is important to follow the process, I think this is what I'm taking away, again, as a non-lawyer, non-expert here, as one of the most important points here. And that does, again, as I mentioned, make me a little bit optimistic that NextDecade can, again, finish going through this process and get, maybe they just have to make the supplemental environmental impact statement and, get their final approval after they do go through that process. But they're not necessarily saying, you know what, we showed that there were significant negative impacts to the environment or to these, or the environmental justice communities that are going to actually halt the project and mean that it could never get approved, right? So that's a lot of my read on this. So hopefully that gives you some instance. Again, you can read through the whole thing. You can just search for this court order by the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, and you can find it. It's available publicly. But that's the main point that I wanted, or that's what I wanted you to get away from it. That's what I read from it, is that the Court of Appeals, this is again specifically about the process that was incorrectly followed, not necessarily about Rio Grande and not being able to move forward, and that there is some horrible environmental impacts there that are going to preclude the project ever being approved. So the big question here is what happens next, and so it seems like there was the the press release. They basically said they're looking at all of their options here. They're reassessing all of their options. That's what the company said. At the moment, there could be some sort of a court appeal. I mean, they could appeal up. I guess I don't know if the next level would be the Supreme Court or some other court. I don't know the court system to that level of granularity. That to me seems unlikely because as a non-expert, when I read through what the DC Circuit Court of Appeals wrote here, it does actually make sense. Where they're saying, hey, you should have followed the process, and you didn't follow the process. It's not obvious to me that any higher level court is going to disagree with that ruling or conclusion here. Again, I'm a non-expert, so maybe I'm totally off base, but that passes my common sense filter. Not that means that it's good for good in the eyes of the law. So to me, I think it seems more likely this will actually go back to FERC and let them go through the process and be able to issue that environmental impact statement, the supplemental one, and be able to then make a determination of the approval for NextDecade's Rio Grande facility and for the Texas LNG facility after having gone through that process. Now, the additional big question, if that is the case, is what happens in the meantime. And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be any precedent for this. Transient Stacker asked the question, how long do you think that will take to get reapproved? I don't know. And I was going to talk through here. I can go over just real quick, just so you have this in your head. I went and pulled up the original schedule when NextDecade got the approval in the first place. So this was, in September of 2018 was when they actually got scheduling. They got this scheduling notice where they basically said, now they have a timeline for actually getting their environmental impact statement. And so they said, hey, we're going to have this draft by October, final environmental impact statement by April. And they were supposed to have it, their decision on are you actually authorized or not based on, this environmental impact statement in July of 2019. So this was the original timeline that they received. That was in September 2018. They did get their final environmental impact statement in April of 2019, which again, that was right on as planned back in September. And then they were supposed to get that decision, as I mentioned, in July. And they even thought that was the case as of April 26th, 2019. But they did not get that final approval until November. I don't know that there's a good rhyme or reason as to why it took that long. I just think that I'll hold my tongue on that, but it did take a little bit longer. But that gives you an idea of how long this took for the original one. And I as they alluded to it here, where I think there's supposed to be a 45-day public comment period. I guess if I maybe search in here, maybe public comment. So I think they talk about it here where this is a 45-day period for a supplemental environmental impact statement. So at the very least, it would take them time to create this supplemental environmental impact statement, which I believe FERC does, again, with input from NextDecade and, potentially other third-party sources. But I believe FERC is the one who would be responsible for actually creating that. And then there would be this 45-day public comment period at a minimum. and then they could issue, maybe they have to do some rework there in response to the public comments, and then they could issue the final the final supplemental environmental impact statement, I believe, and then, some point after that is when they would actually make the determination of, are you approved or not approved. So that, again, I'm not an expert in the industry, but I would expect this to be, at least a 3-month process, at the least. 6 months maybe seems more likely as a, reasonable minimum. It could take even longer, right? We're talking the federal government. So that is all I know, and that's all I can tell you. Again, maybe somebody who's in the industry, or somebody who practices energy law really would have a much better idea for you. But I think it's just unpredictable in terms of how long is it going to take FERC to do these things, because it is, as far as I understand it, because of specifically what the issue was here. Again, the process that FERC followed incorrectly the first time. I think this is going to be mostly in FERC's control, not in the company's control. So again, as I mentioned, I think the big question is, are they going to be able to continue construction in the meantime or not, right? Because if they are, then, our future cash flows as investors are the timeline doesn't change. What does change, obviously, is number one, probably additional legal fees in the meantime, which hopefully this is not ridiculous. The other thing that is going to change is there is going to be this binary event at some point where they either their approval does get upheld, or their approval gets taken away entirely because they find out, actually, because of this facility, there are, irreconcilable, whatever you call it, environmental impacts from this project. And so, we can't possibly move forward with the project as it is or anything close to it. So that's pretty, seems unlikely to me, given that they did go through this process to date. The one thing that I do worry about, is, how much do politics play into this, right? As we know, we're in an election year, and there is a lot of politics around fossil fuel energy sources, right? LNG being one of them. And I think LNG, of course, is billed as one of the cleanest fossil fuels, but it is a fossil fuel nonetheless. And there's a lot of folks who have, issues with fossil fuels and have, politics comes into it. And that is something that I worry about. And I did actually go back and look, because I hadn't checked this recently, the actual composition of the FERC commissioners. And if you look at this, there are 2 commissioners that have been around since effectively for quite a while. I think this gentleman here, Willie Phillips, has been around for a while. I think so he was sworn in December of 2021. If I recall, maybe I'm wrong, but I think he voted in favor of multiple LNG facilities before. Maybe I could be wrong, but I feel like that was the case. There is also this gentleman, Mark Christie. He was appointed by, President Trump. So presumably, since he was sworn in early 2021, he was appointed by Trump. Presumably this guy is pretty pro fossil fuels, at least in terms of, he's not going to be significantly biased against them. Let me put it that way. That's my worry. My worry is that if there happen to be, these some folks who want to really get politics involved in FERC, and that would worry me a little bit. And so this is where I'm getting to my point here, is there were 3 additional commissioners who've been sworn in just the past 2 months. This gentleman, David Rosner, sworn in June 2024. Same with this lady here, Lindsay C., sworn in June 2024 once again. And then this lady here, Judy Chang, she was sworn in July of 2024, so last month. And my point here is these were people who are clearly selected, I assume selected by the current administration, which I think is a little more hostile to fossil fuels. That worries me a little bit, especially if we get around to, if FERC moves quickly and makes a decision this year, before the election happens. Of course, if the Democrats win again in November, then, there's not going to be any difference after November, right? Because of that. But if it happened to flip over to Republican administration, it is possible that, I don't know. the degree to which these folks would swap out, or could get replaced if the politics were involved in this thing. But I have to imagine that with a Republican administration, in the Oval Office, that would probably it would probably preclude the worst outcomes here in terms of politics getting involved of common sense, let's say, or I'll leave it at that. But that is just one thing. That's the way that I'm looking at this. So it does worry me a little bit that there are 3 commissioners who were probably very clearly picked by the current administration. But again, if they're just following their jobs and current regulations, like there have been a number of things that have gone through even during the past 3.5 years and have actually gotten their approvals through FERC. So I don't think it's a humongous risk even with these folks there. And again, I did not do any detailed research on any of these folks. I don't know anything about them other than when they were actually sworn in. So I don't really know. I don't have any strong confidence in being worried there. But that's just the best way that I have to look at this without spending all day trying to research all these folks. And if any want to, feel free to research them. Yeah, I'd be happy to know what you find out if you do learn anything. So that's kind of how I'm looking at it. But one other thing that I keep in mind for NextDecade is, and I guess I don't really have a visual for this, but they have billions of dollars on their side at this point, right? There's been loads and loads of money already lined up for this project. They have banks that have already given them banks and or the equity partners that have given them literally billions of dollars. And so at this point, it's not just this tiny little company NextDecade with a dream and that's about it, trying to get everybody to sign off on their stuff. There have already been billions of dollars spent. I think if you look at their most recent quarter, I think it's $2.5 billion roughly has changed hands already for this project. And so in my mind, that's actually a pretty big incentive, where there are some rich people behind the scenes who are not going to want to see this fail because they're not going to see a cent of that back, right? It's sort of, they're in it together where you can question whether things are going to work out or not long term for your cash flows. Maybe NextDecade goes under or whatever. If there were, again, I don't think it's like, I'm just saying the risk that you're taking when you lend this money for the actual company's performance, the LNG market, those sorts of things. That's in one category. There's another category of risks you didn't really think you were taking or didn't think were significant, where approvals that are already in place get yanked away. When there are people with billions of dollars, I have to assume that they have some amount of influence to actually, grease the wheels and make sure that that FERC reapproves this project, because otherwise some of those parties are going to be out quite a bit of money for kind of I'm not going to call it a ridiculous reason, but a reason they certainly didn't expect. And so if it's within their power to influence it, I think that they will. So that I think is the one bit that gives me. It moves me a little more towards being optimistic here rather than sort of just neutral, is that, again, when rich people want something to be done in politics, I think they are able to make that happen. So that's kind of my end conclusion here. It is a risk for the company for sure. I think it's maybe a bit overblown given, the reaction of the stock all the way down below $5 now, whereas it had been trading, roughly at about $8. So, we lost a fair bit there. What's that, 40%, 30%, something like that. A pretty significant drawdown here in just a couple of days, largely just because of this. And I don't want to discount it. I think this is a significant risk. It puts the company in a much higher risk situation than it was a week ago, at least as far as the risk that we realized. But, I do think there's a couple things that are pointing towards this not being, such a humongous risk here. So, if you're willing to take additional risk, I think it's not of course, it's your decision. Sorry, I was about to say something, and I do not want to make investment recommendations for anybody. I will tell you personally, I haven't sold any of my shares. And, if I had more cash at the moment, I would probably be buying some more of this. I don't for, personal reasons at the moment, but, it is a higher risk, high reward situation. But I personally think for me at the current price, I believe the additional reward that you can get by buying, at about $5 rather than $8, more than makes up for the additional risk that we have that this isn't end up gonna, be getting reapproved at some point. So that is all I had. I see there are, I think, 8 or 9 people in here. So love to see it. Thank you. I appreciate everybody hopping on here. I mean, if there's anybody has questions or comments, I'll stick around for another couple minutes. But that is most of what I had for prepared content here. Just while I'm waiting to see if anybody has any questions or comments on the chat, I will say that I generally on my channel try to do streams as many Sundays as I can. I think probably starting in the fall, be more consistent to be able to do, most Sunday afternoons, not every Sunday, but that's my general cadence that I've been trying to keep up with. And, when the summer's over and, our family schedule gets sort of back on a more normal cadence, I think Sunday afternoons are more realistic for me to do this. All right. So Transient Stacker says, do you know of any projects that have been denied approval by FERC? So I couldn't tell you them off the top of my head. I do believe there have been projects that were denied approval from FERC, but I don't think, and this is, again, I'm not an expert, but I haven't heard of any other comparables where they got the original approval and then were later denied, right? And which is the situation we're in with NextDecade. So again, something that was, got the approvals, started construction, but later on some appeal had their approval yanked away or overturned. So for that particular situation, I don't believe there have been any other projects for which that has happened. So that's where that's what I said. I think we're a little bit in uncharted territory. And Ree asks, any bottom, or is it such a unique situation that no one can guess it correctly? Yeah, it's definitely a unique situation. I don't think anybody knows. Again, because sort of to the prior question, my prior point, I don't think any other company has been in this situation before, where they had the approval and then I got yanked away. What happens? As I said, there have already been billions of dollars who've changed hands. They thought that this was, already checked off in terms of the things that we need to do to get get the project in order, get most of our risks, pretty well mitigated. This was one that I think most folks involved thought, okay, they went through this process, years-long process, and maybe I didn't call that out as much as I could have. I started the process, my process timeline from when they actually got sort of their FERC scheduling to actually get some answers, but they started the process, the application, back in May of 2016, right? So that was a more than 3-year process from application to approval for the full thing, right? So this is not a short process. It's not something that's light. You can go and search. I don't know if I could find it. I guess it would be Rio Grande Final Environmental Impact Statement. At least I can find the actual document here because it's a massive document. Let's see if this gets you to, just to give you an idea that this isn't the full document. I think maybe all of these links are the final environmental impact statement, right? So this is it, volume 1 of it, right? This is a 700-page document. So up front, this was a lot of work. This wasn't like a, 10-page document where they kind of wrote through some stuff, but I mean, they did a lot in these things. And, a lot of this is not necessarily environmental impact. It's documenting what exactly is all of this facility. I've read through a good chunk of this years ago. I've been invested in NextDecade for quite a while, but this is a pretty thorough process that they went through. What does it mean now that they already went through all of this? They thought they had the approvals, billions of dollars have changed hands, and now they sort of went back on the approval. I don't know. Again, this is where I go back to and I say, what did the DC Circuit Court of Appeals actually say? And if you read through it, the way that I understand it, it's, again, not a lawyer, and I could be totally wrong. They're more saying, you guys didn't follow the process. It's really important that you follow the process, because if you don't and we let this go through, that sets a precedent so that in the future, other projects also won't go through the process. It didn't, and I'm distinguishing that from the DC Circuit Court of Appeals didn't seem to have any particular issues about the Rio Grande project. So I really think that they're going to be able to go back through this process and get their approval. Again, it is a risk. It is a significant risk, but it doesn't seem like there's been any statements yet that have said, yeah, this project can't go forward because there are significant negative impacts that we can't mitigate in any way, shape, or form, right? And this is a thing to note. There are environmental impacts. It's not like there's nothing. There are certainly environmental impacts from these, and they have gone through some efforts to actually, make new habitats for wildlife, move wildlife out of there. Was something with turtles and something with, I think, ocelots, if I recall correctly. So they went through all this process to understand what are the impacts, and then they said, hey, you're going to impact some of these species. How do we mitigate that? That's the work that they've already done. And seems a little bit, it would be surprising to me at least. So I'm not going to say it's unlikely, but it would at least be surprising to me if there are new impacts that come along from this that they're not able to mitigate somehow. So that's, again, my read on it. So take from that what you will, but I am still holding all of my shares in this company. It is a pretty significant position for me in terms of my overall portfolio. So that's kind of, sorry, that was a long answer to your actual question, which was, is there any bottom? I don't know, right? Because this is all just how much risk do folks want to take. I think a lot of people probably who were invested in NextDecade were in it because they believe this is a fairly, I don't call it low risk, low reward, but, kind of like a low risk thing where, there's going to be future cash flows out of this. They're going to come when the facility is done in 4 years. We're willing to be patient. We're willing to wait because we think the risk is low. They've already got approvals. They've already got, the full EPC contract with Bechtel. They've got the financing lined up. There's a clear line of sight to future cash flows, and we're willing to be patient. So we'll just sit here and hold our shares at $8. Sooner or later, they're going to be able to pay out dividends or share buybacks or whatever, and going to be returning value to shareholders. And we're willing to be patient for that. I don't think people signed up for, people who were invested in the stock or who invested in it post FID, none of them wanted to take this risk, right? That they probably invested after FID because they didn't want to take these sorts of risks. And so, where's the bottom? I think you really have to ask how many people are unwilling to take the risk that, they might not get an additional FERC approval, or, the risk that construction is going to get paused and slowed down, the risk that, they're going to have to spend additional money to do additional mitigations for some environmental impacts. Those are all new risks that exist, that are much more clear they exist today that we didn't realize we were taking on a week ago. So that's, to kind of figure out where's the bottom, it's how many of those people were there. I think the news is pretty well disseminated by this point. So, everybody who, I'm sort of going to say a short-term thing where maybe you could make the argument that everybody who wanted to sell out and didn't want to take these risks has already done it. It's hard to say. Sometimes institutional holders who have a large position, they can't just sell out of it in 1 day or even 2 days because it would, there just literally isn't enough buying demand on the other side to actually let them unload those shares at the rate that they want. So it's hard to say, but that's the best answer I can give you. So it's hard to say what the bottom could be. It could keep dropping, could go down to 4, it could even go down to 3. Maybe people are just done with this. There's too much risk. They don't think there's enough upside. I've heard a lot of people who, sort of view NextDecade as a, lower reward company, meaning they didn't actually do a good job of capturing enough, tolling fees on their contracts. And, so it could go, there is no necessarily any bottom here, but if you think, let me put it this way, I think it's fairly likely that they're still going to get their approval one way or another. I think it's likely, and again, I'm not an expert, but it would seem really surprising to me if they made them pause their construction, if they couldn't get some sort of I'm not sure the actual legal term, right? I know there is one, I just forget it at the moment because I'm not a lawyer. But, sort of an authorization to continue with construction while they are working through this additional process with FERC. If they're able to do that, then the timing of your future cash flows isn't going to change. If they do eventually get the approval sometime between now and, 2027, which is should be plenty of time for FERC to go through their process, then, in the end, it doesn't change other than maybe some additional legal fees or some additional, development research fees, whatever you're going to call it, to actually supply additional information to FERC. So, the net result for what's going to happen to the stock in, 2029, 2028 timeframe doesn't change. So I don't know what the short-term bottom is. I'm not particularly worried about it because, as long as those two things happen that I said, they can continue construction and they eventually get the FERC approval sometime in the next 3 years, the net result to me doesn't, it doesn't change because I plan to hold my shares that long. All right. Again, I think that was everything all the content I had to say. Hopefully, I think I pretty much beat that to death. Again, let me know if you have any other questions or comments. I'll stick around just for another minute. Otherwise, I will hop off. I really appreciate all the folks who joined today. Still 6 folks here. I really appreciate that. That's awesome. Again, let me know if you have any questions or comments. Otherwise, I'm going to hop off. And yeah. Obviously, it's disappointing. I was surprised that it even dropped below 6. In the short term, I was thinking, well, it dropped from 8, chopping off down to about 6, losing 25%. That seems about the right risk premium here for this thing because it doesn't seem like that large of a risk. Now it's down, slightly below 5, which was surprising to me. But, I've never been able to really understand or to predict the short-term market movements, So, all right, I don't see anything else on the chat. Looks like maybe people are starting to drop off here. So, yeah, if there's nothing else anybody wants to say, I am going to hop off. I really appreciate everybody being here and watching. Thank you very much. Have a good one.